Hello and welcome to a new episode of Never Mind the Dam Busters, the podcast dedicated to all things Bomber Command. I'm not quite sure what number episode we're up to now. I've got completely lost off. Stopped referring to the episodes by number anyway, and we never release them in the order that we record them, so it just gets totally confusing. Anyway, welcome. Glad that you're here. Now, before we begin, we just wanted to share some news with you. Good Pods has announced that Never Mind the Dam Busters is its number one podcast of the month in military history. We've also made number 2 in the top 100 aviation podcasts monthly chart, number 5 in the top 100 military history all-time chart, and number 12 in the top 100 aviation pods all-time chart, which is all very fabulous and a massive surprise, really. So a huge thank you to everyone who's listened, shared, contributed questions and topics, mentioned us on social media, and a particular thank you to all of our paid subscribers for their support. Now, we've got something a little bit different for you today. Now, I know that I say that in every single episode that we do, but we really have this time. We're going to be debating the very, very thorny subject of veteran stories and testimony. Now, in his groundbreaking work on Holocaust survivor testimony, the historian Christopher Browning cautioned against the unquestioning acceptance of testimony. He argued that the greatest challenge to the historian in the use of survivor testimony as historical evidence is posed not by those who are inherently hostile to it, but rather by those who embrace it too uncritically and emotionally. It is perhaps something that we've all been guilty of at some stage. I mean, which of us hasn't been mesmerised by a particular veteran sharing his story? And I know I have plenty of times. And this led me to think about, why do veterans relay their accounts of their experiences in a particular way? To what extent are their accounts influenced by things like collective memory or accepted narrative, a need for catharsis, and the cultural, social and political context of the time in which they're telling their story? Is there a danger that the giving of testimony has taken on a performative element, and that the finely honed and often repeated account has gained in the telling over the years and bears no relation to actual historical events anymore? So what traps await us in the memory minefield? In recent years, as the last of our beloved Bomber Command aircrew fade away and the Second World War begins to fade from living memory, it seems weird saying that, doesn't it? In our haste to accord veterans due respect, there has perhaps been a tendency towards a belief that the authenticity of veteran stories is more important than their factual accuracy. Now, many of you will know that I'm a lawyer by profession, and I've always been fascinated by evidence gathering and witness testimony. And these are issues that come up regularly for me, both in my legal work and in my historical research and writing. So to mull over these quite thorny issues, today I'm joined by Ally Campbell-Grieve, who some of you will know from the WWII and wargaming community. Ally studied broadcast journalism at university before falling into a career in insurance. Spent some time in the Army Reserves, including a period of mobilisation and a tour of duty in Helmand province in Afghanistan, followed by a move into policing. Inspired by his late father, Ally developed a passion for military history, which is now challenging into his research on his great-uncle's career in Bomber Command. That's quite a varied career. Welcome, Ally. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Jane. It's great to be here as a fellow seeker of evidence.
Yeah, is it out there? Does it actually exist? That's the question. So today you're going to be talking about your great-uncle, Keith James Stevens, who was known as Steve, I believe, to friends and family, about his incredible story and also the difficulties that you've encountered, well, let's say with the veracity of certain parts of Steve's story. So can you tell us a little bit about Steve's background and how he came to volunteer for Bomber Command?
Yeah, so Steve was my great-uncle by marriage to my grandfather's sister, Anita, and he was born and grew up in Australia. His father was invalided out of the Australian Army from the First World War, saw action with the Pioneer Corps at Poitiers. So it's a wonder that he had any thirst to go to war at all off the back of that. But probably escaping fairly mundane kind of rural existence. In his account, he'll say seeking adventure wasn't part of his motivation, but that's written in 2003 and not 1940. Yeah. So that's one that's up for debate. But he goes to the RAF recruiting office in Melbourne in 1941, or in 1940, in fact, because his medical is 1940. But he's enlisted May 1941. sails to Canada with a lot of other Australians and New Zealanders for his training.
Do they go across the Pacific? Do they see the Pacific?
That's an excellent question. I've got all the notes regarding the ship he was on, and part of my research on the to-do list will be to look at those convoys, and especially from the convoy from Canada, from Halifax to the UK, because I'm sure that in itself is an undertaking, isn't it?
Yeah,
that you've already gone from Australia, a dangerous undertaking to go from Australia to Canada, and then Canada to England in 1942 at the time. So, it was training over in Canada. Eventually arrives in the UK in 1942, where he goes 15 OTU and starts to ply his trade in at Wellington. Crewed up with
what's his role? Is he a pilot, or what's his actual?
No, a wireless operator. Yeah,
wireless.
Wireless
that's
operator.
Right, wireless operator. Yeah.
So he, 15 OTU. So in Wellington's, initially obviously plying his trade, and he flies his first operation in 15th of September, 1942, while he's still at the OTU, and that is the Grand National Raid on Essen. I think it's nicknamed the Grand National Raid. So as a first operation, it's quite
hairy,
quite a big one. And then so from there he gets posted he goes through his heavy conversion unit with 9 Squadron. Then initially on the course starts on Manchester's, but then switches to Lancaster's halfway through that course, and then arrives at 57 Squadron for his first tour. And that first tour is really, because you're sort of talking about the tail end, it's 2 operations which are right up your alley because they're mine laying operations to begin with, in December of 42. And then really we're talking about the first half for the first tour of 1943. So it's the Battle of the Ruhr, really. So he goes to Duisburg more than any other destination, but all the classic Battle of the Ruhr destinations are in there. So it's been really fascinating, getting really stuck into the archives around those raids and anything I can read or find out about those, really. And then his first tour, in which he earns a DFM, ends sort of July 43. He in fact has done 29 plus 7 which were unsuccessful, and then they go that's enough for now. So he didn't need to make the magic 30, although one of those operations, I think maybe optimistically thinking it might still count, they put the jettisoned, or in the operational record book it says they jettisoned the bombs on an enemy airfield and returned due to engine failure. Yeah. So we've got no way of really confirming that. But in the operational record book, it doesn't count. But maybe, in the minds of the senior leadership within the squadron, they thought that's enough for most of the crew. The mid-upper gunner and the rear gunner had to go on and do sort of 3 or 4 other operations because they'd had some sickness during the tour. So they went on with other crews to do a few.
So he's lucky to survive
pretty common
that full tour then, given the destinations that he's bombing and the time period that we're talking about. Very lucky indeed. But then he goes on.
Very much so.
He goes on to begin a second tour, doesn't he? Yeah. But how long? What sort of gap does he have between his tours, and what's he doing in the meantime?
Well, it's almost what kind of initially drew me to the story and makes it rather unique. But there is a big gap, which means his second tour doesn't start till the 27th of January. 1944.
Right.
So in that time, during his first tour, he's been commissioned, and he skips flying officer and goes from pilot officer being acting flight lieutenant and takes up the role as squadron signals leader. So I think the
which is very unusual for a wireless operator.
Is that they would, at the end of the first tour, you get a posting to an OTU or some other instructional area, or to maybe 5 Group HQ or whatever group you happen to be in. It's a really good way. It's a really good way at that juncture of getting rid of people that might be absolutely fine, but aren't who you want to stick around. You'd probably have to be fairly, above average to get one of those kind of posts as a leader within that squadron, because you've got other people from other squadrons vying for those kind of posts. So that sort of leads me to believe that he was good at his job and probably well liked.
So he stayed with the same squadron to do that then?
Yeah.
That's very unusual.
So in that period of time, he's had a couple of liaison attachments with various OTUs. He's also spent a couple of weeks down at the Bombing Development Unit at Newmarket. There are various things in his account which I can't corroborate. So things like the setting up of 630 Squadron at Eastkirk, being involved in that, being involved in when because they're at Scampton initially, 617 obviously get formed there. And so he may well have been involved in sorting some signal stuff out for them and getting some bits off the ground. But I think it's an easy one and perhaps we see that quite regularly with people latching on to the 617 legend, and sort of anything that you can kind of claw from that in your testimony.
Extra kudos, isn't it?
Seems to get a mention, yeah. And I find that really intriguing, and I've got no real way, because unless he was flying, there's very little going to be written about that within 617's operational record books, whereas Steve has perhaps made out a bit more in his account that he had not a pivotal role by any means, but certainly a role to play. And maybe in testimony we have to, there's certain elements that there's an element of good faith if we haven't got the evidence.
Certainly.
As long as we acknowledge that's, we're accepting that account based on good faith and
face value
and no solid evidence of that happening. So he was busy during that period, and then his second tour starts, as I say, in January, and at that point he's acting flight lieutenant, being paid a flight lieutenant's wage from the records I've got, and signals leader. So all he's doing is, when there's kind of a maximum effort, he is pitching in when there's a sick wireless op, that sort of thing. So it's very random. He flies with a lot of random crews. When the CO of the squadron wants to fly on an operation, generally he's flown in. So there's 3 or 4 ops where he flies with the wing commander, but otherwise it's pitching in. And he eventually gets shot down on a raid to Saint-Lô-d'Esserand, which are the caves with the V1 storage, in July of 44.
So he's still there in the July. That's a really long second tour then, isn't it? Yeah.
So that aircraft gets shot down, and it's obviously it's always a tragedy, isn't it? But it's a risk of the business you're in, I suppose. But the crew he flies with have done 3 or 4 operations.
Right.
And by that point, he's sort of 7 into his second tour. They all managed to bail out of the aircraft, which is, I'm glad of that. And 3 are taken prisoner and 4 managed to evade, including Steve. So he is holed up with various French resistance people in just north of Paris, as are some other people. That's found that unbelievably fascinating. The stories that are in the MI9, IS9 reports of evaders who return to the UK, of what they're getting up to, assisting the Maquis, the resistance, with tasks. The pilot, Owen, was an apprentice armourer before the war within the RAF, went to pilot training, so he ended up becoming an armourer effectively for the resistance while he was being hidden. And Steve recounts, delivering messages on bicycles and that sort of thing while he's with the resistance, and taking the nom de plume of Claude, which sort of suited him. It's all very hello because he gets hidden in, there's 2 bars which he gets hidden in. Only with a sort of, rather than Carstairs, it's an Australian accent.
Yeah, we love Fairfax and Carstairs. So how long is he actually with these people in France for, sort of being sheltered and protected?
He gets liberated by Americans who are pushing through Clermont, which is the Clermont north of Paris, on the 2nd of September.
Right.
So he's for quite a while. It's night of the 7th of July to the 2nd of September.
The best part of 2 months then. Yeah.
The first 3 or 4 days on his own, walking and hiding in woods and cornfields and so forth, and then he gets picked up by a farmer, and that gets handed on through a few different people until there's sort of 2 main families he ends up staying with in these various bars and restaurants.
It's just unimaginable, isn't it? It really is. I mean, sort of the constant fear that you must have all the time that the next person who walks through the door or whatever is going to, betray you or whatever. It must be absolute torment.
Yeah, I think that's really borne out. And what I find, one of the things I find particularly interesting about the different sort of, with his account and what I found in the records of that time, it must have affected him, because the first is when you've evaded, you come back to the UK and you have an interview with MI9, IS9, the intelligence branch in charge of escape and evasion. And post that, if you're Australian, or I imagine the similar thing happens with the Canadians, you would go to Kodak House, which is the Royal Australian Air Force headquarters in the UK, in England. And he has a very similar interview there. And in that interview, he says that he's given the choice or allowed to put down some options of what do you want to do now. And in his account, he says that he wasn't allowed to fly over Germany anymore or over occupied territory because of evading and that sort of thing. It really implies that he wanted to do that, and that was sort of taken away from him. But his two choices are go back to Australia for a period of rest. Well, that sounds lovely. Why wouldn't you? Yeah. And his second one is to go to, I think it was 27 OTU. It's an operational training unit which has a particular penchant for people from, in inverted commas, the Dominions. And I think it's just completely at odds with that sort of the gung ho. Or of course, I wanted to go back to an operational squadron. He eventually gets sent home and then is working in an admin role at a cricket ground with the RAF that's been commandeered by the Australian Air Force, and then leaves to return to civilian life off his own request. So there's sort of a clear evidence that he's sort of done that can be from that bombing experience, and then the experience of being, on the run. As nice as it would be to be in a French bar for 2 months, in that situation, that's got to take it out of you. And I think the conclusion of his war and the conclusion of his testimony sort of really diverge in terms of motivation, and that's really interesting, I think.
Yeah. You've sort of come across a few other problems as well when you've been researching Steve's story, haven't you? A number of inconsistencies and things he's said or accounts that he's given that just can't be borne out by the records and just don't tally with the research that you've actually come across. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. I think what's key, and maybe you're not surprised at the length of his service, but that kind of block where he appears to be doing other sort of general duties, attachments here and there. He mentions, apart from his signals leaders course, he doesn't mention any of that in his book, probably because when he's written it, and it's a self-published book, there are probably 40 or 50 copies around.
How long after the war did he write that?
Oh, sorry. So 2003.
Oh,
so a long time.
Very long time. Yeah.
Yeah. He's lost his logbook was stolen, and that seems to be really key. And whether that incident has been an enabling factor in the account he ends up writing, or whether it's unintentionally become a factor in the account he's writing, because he doesn't have that to draw on to say, I went on these operations. But what is interesting is that his entire first tour is accurately recorded by destination and date in his book. So he must have access to that information.
Got some records.
And I can only assume that he perhaps the Middlebrook Everett Bible that we all refer to, but that information is there. What he then records in the interim between the end of his first tour and when he starts his second are a number of operations which I can't find any record of him going on. Now, I'm not casting aspersions, and I don't want to say lying about that for effect, or he's deliberately trying to blur up his own record. But interestingly, I think he would have, a signals leader, he would have a good knowledge of those operations, of the operations that happened. In addition to that, if he's got a copy of the Bomber Command War Diaries or something similar, where he's got access to those dates and the destinations, then if he remembers vividly poring over the maps of the Peenemünde raid, being in the briefings because he has to get up and do the signals leader bit, and he's kind of combining that with the memory of flying anyway, he's come to the conclusion of, well, I must have done those operations.
Yeah.
I'm satisfied he hasn't, because in his his annual report, which is 40. The one I've got from the Royal Australian Air Force Archive is 43 to 44, August to August. It lists the hours he's flown, and that's been, he signed that off. The hours he's flown are the hours that we know about, that are in the operational record book. His kind of end of war report, if you like, has also lists those operations, Essen 2, Duisburg 4, whatever it might be. And that's, he hasn't counted that at all. That, he signed that document. So I'm happy that's true. So it sort of leaves a bit of not a bad taste at all in the mouth. I think it's an interesting, it's something to learn from, certainly, and something to analyse, and partly what makes, I think, his account fascinating for me as someone who works in an investigative role within the police. So I'm really hungry to try and pursue that evidence. And, and again, like the 617 thing, something to hang your hat on is D-Day, Operation Overlord. And again, he would have been heavily involved in the briefing for that. And he remarks that one of the pilots came in saying his wife's operator is sick. Can you come? And he said, in his account, he says no, because I'm busy. I've got to do this. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll go. I'll put my kit already on the plane, and I'll meet you there, so we don't have to go through the normal channels, so that I won't get a rollicking. But the person he names as the pilot didn't fly on the 6th of June with the squadron, and in fact he gets the name slightly wrong
60 years later,
and with no logbook. With no logbook. And it's also like, who's he right, who
it's a crucial issue, isn't it? Yeah.
Is he encouraged into doing it? I haven't got that answer. I don't think so. I don't know much about his family in Australia, so I don't know that he's been forced into this. So what his motivation for writing it in the first place is up for debate as well.
Yeah. There's a really interesting passage, General, that you've mentioned in our discussions, and that's the discrepancy that the book makes that he wrote about when he was captured and left in a room with a German. Tell us about that incident, because that's all a bit of a mystery, isn't it?
Yeah. It's written, it could have come straight. It's a narrative from a Commando comic. Previously in the book, he has talked about it going on what he terms as a commando course, but I think is going to be, it's just one of those kind of battle school. So I think, that's what he's gone on. And almost to make use of those skills, this opportunity presents itself in the accounts, which is where he is captured, and he has to dispatch this German that's sort of guarding him or about to question him before he gets carted off to, I don't know, wherever. And although you think it's certainly a plausible story, of course it is, and it's written in a very plausible way, and it sort of fits in the general narrative of what he said about his time evading. However, again, we go back to the kind of Kodak House interview, the post-evasion interview, which happens 4 or 5 days after he gets back. And there are blunt questions, which read, I will read this verbatim. Were you at any time in the hands of the enemy as a prisoner of war? If so, state circumstances of capture and subsequent escape. And he's replied, no.
No.
Were you identified by the enemy as being in enemy-occupied territory? If so, state details of identification. No. Did you injure or kill any enemy whilst evading? No. And that's a document he signed immediately after evading. So again, the motivation for putting that in the account, I don't know. It could be a genuine memory that he's just adopted someone else's story. So as a member of the Caterpillar Club and various Air Force associations and stuff, he went to numerous dinners. He really celebrated his service, and there are sort of two routes to go down with that. Some people downplay it, and some people, and it's not wrong at all, celebrate their service, and Steve was one of those people. And I think every year you have a dinner like that, a few bottles of VB, everyone's telling stories, and it becomes a bit of a story off. I've been in a number of military dinners.
Well,
that's just what happened. That's just what happened. Yeah. And I think I can draw that same parallel with, if I talk about my experience in Afghanistan, I could talk about a particular day or incident, and I could tell you what my memory of that is, but I'm acutely aware that memory is going to be made up of my specific memory, what I can tell you about that. But also contributory factors are going to be conversations I've had with my friends and colleagues who are also there, and also these things just naturally develop in the telling of these things. So, if I told a particular story, I'd have to stop myself and think, did it happen like that or didn't it? And that's only 12 years ago.
Yeah.
11
The
years
thing
ago.
is, you can convince yourself as well that that's how something happened, can't you? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that the waters are definitely muddied for historians when considering veteran testimony, which may have been given many years or even decades later, like Steve's. I know some veterans that I interviewed have been telling their stories for decades, but others still had only felt able to begin sharing their experiences in their twilight years. So I think the question is that how should we approach accounts shared sometimes 70 or 80 years after the events described? I know that great work's been done by many academics on this very thorny subject in recent years. And I particularly want to mention Frances Houghton's book, The Veteran's Tale, British Military Memoirs of the Second World War, which was published in 2019. She does a really brilliant oversight of all the various factors that can sort of influence how veterans tell their stories, really. And there's also some really good research being carried out by the team at the University of Lincoln in conjunction with the International Bomber Command Centre. James Greenhalgh's recently published work develops these themes further, and among other issues, he also explores how the fear of the LMF label, which we talked about a couple of episodes ago, has continued to shape the testimony of Bomber Command veterans even after 2015. I mean, I can't remember what I was doing 3 years ago. Can you? I mean, what did you have for tea on the afternoon of 15th of March 1987? How do we expect people to have accurate memories of things which happened 80 years ago, often in the most traumatic and confusing circumstances? I think we have to be careful. Veteran accounts should never be accepted purely at face value in terms of the factual information which they purport to convey. But the popular history books are full of them, aren't they? What I think is that veterans' accounts are invaluable in providing illumination of the human response to particular events and situations. As far as facts are concerned, mistakes as to dates or places or names or the order of events are bound to happen with the passage of time and are entirely to be expected. But that then takes us on to another question. How do we deal with those accounts which are clearly a complete fabrication in a deliberate attempt to deceive, where, for example, squadron records demonstrate quite clearly that a particular gentleman never served as aircrew of that particular squadron, let alone flew on a particular raid? The issue of Walter Mitty type characters or stolen valour for our listeners across the Atlantic is an age-old problem. There's nothing new about it. So we're talking about people who either invent or embellish and exaggerate stories of service in the armed forces. Now, I recently spent some considerable length of time going through the entire operational record book of 10 Squadron Bomber Command on behalf of a gentleman whose father had told him that he was a tail gunner in the squadron. It was believed he'd taken part in numerous operations between 1944 and 1945. I could not find any mention of this guy anywhere. There was no record of him at all. His son later obtained his service records, and these revealed that the man, in fact, had been in training when the war ended and hadn't even arrived back in the UK to start flying operationally until April 1945. So the war ended before he could ever actually fly operationally. Now, the family were really upset with me and formed the view that the documentary evidence in the service records and the squadron records must be wrong. And these sorts of situations are sadly not uncommon and very, very difficult to deal with when the fated veteran is still with us. It's a very delicate path which we have to tread between dealing with family sensitivities and ensuring that the factual veracity and integrity of veteran accounts, I think. But it's a path that we haven't got to fear to tread. One thing which you touched on earlier, Ally, and that's we've got to be mindful of the influence of popular media such as film, radio, and television to implant images and to shape the manner and the language in which stories are retold. There's a famous example from Christopher Browning's work, the Holocaust historian. I mentioned it at the beginning. And he describes how some Holocaust survivors altered or adapted their testimony to incorporate memories of events which they could not ever have witnessed And this was after they'd watched the film Schindler's List. So we get oft-related stories, tropes and themes can become incorporated in testimony almost by a process of osmosis. This is the kind of thing that you're talking about at the squadron or regimental dinner or whatever. One man's memories merging with those of his former comrades until it becomes virtually impossible to separate out who did what and where and when. And you also have to think about those veterans whose testimony doesn't fit into accepted narratives. And I think this concept of accepted narrative can present an impediment to veterans to talk about any event or personal experience which is considered to be outside the range of accepted Bomber Command experiences described in the thousands of existing personal accounts, diaries and memoirs. Veterans may feel compelled to keep silent about parts of their experiences or even to manipulate it or adapt their testimony so that it accords with pre-existing narratives and basically tell the person who's interviewing them what they want to hear. This is something which I came across quite a lot when I was doing my mine-laying research because people just hadn't been asked the question about it. And so people then thought it wasn't important and it's not something that they should be talking about. So therefore it doesn't get recorded and it doesn't form part of the popular narratives, if you like. So I think historians have got to be conscious of the influences about the decision-making process of veterans as to what to disclose, what to withhold from their testimony. But equally, they've got to be prepared to challenge these traditional accepted narratives. And I think the pressures on veterans to conform to some sort of typical bomber crew identity could mean that some veterans' experiences have been sort of forgotten or marginalised or even ignored altogether. I wonder, Ali, do you think there may have been a sort of a performative element in Steve's testimony?
I think there is. I tend to agree with the point you raised there, that there is in any testimony to an extent, because by the very nature of you agreeing to give your testimony, there's at least one person listening to that, and you can't not give it in a way in which you're conscious about what you're saying. It's not, no one's catching your thoughts off guard. But I do think with Steve's, it's a self-published book, so I wonder how much he would have had wider performative motivation, because I don't, it wasn't a stage where it was going to be picked up for wider publication or a film or something like that. So
I think we've got to be mindful of the reasons why some veterans choose to share their stories and some absolutely refuse to. My granddad was an 8th Army veteran who served as a sapper in Tunisia and Italy. He talked about the war all the time, but he would only tell you the funny stories. He would never tell you any of the grim stuff, not until very, very late in his life anyway. But my great uncle, who flew a full tour of operations with Bomber Command between 43 and 44, was awarded the DFM, never mentioned it. He never talked about it, not even to his comrades at the local Rafa club. He just would not discuss it. So I think for many veterans, the sharing of their experiences can be a cathartic process. And many of us will have had that one elderly relative who, like my granddad, used to talk about the war all the time. The old Uncle Albert syndrome, for those of you familiar with the British sitcom, Only Fools and Horses. But I think we have to think about why that is. Regular listeners will have heard us interview Tom Davidson, the Halifax flight engineer, in episode 3. And he told me it was only when he reached his early 90s that he actually felt able to talk about what had happened. And once he began, he couldn't stop. He just had to keep talking about it. And sharing his experiences in his 90s has helped him to process the things he'd witnessed and the things that he'd had to do. But that then makes me think about, what about those who are still unable or unwilling to speak about what they witnessed? It doesn't make their experiences any less valid, does it? I also noticed that some veterans are perfectly happy to reminisce about their crewmates, their lives on bomber bases, hijinks in the mess, trips to the village pub. And whenever asked about their memories of particular operations or incidents, they would just clam up. They just didn't want to talk about it. Even many decades later, it was just simply too traumatic for them to do so. And one Bomber Command tail gunner I spent quite a lot of time with still couldn't bear to open and read his logbook. And he was 98. He just couldn't bear to look at it. It was just too upsetting for him. But as we've touched on with other former airmen, it's the very opposite. And we've all come across those who, when asked to describe their experience of a particular operation or incident, will deliver this sort of well-polished, word-perfect and clearly very well-rehearsed account that just trips off the tongue. And the same account will no doubt be given to family members, journalists, historians on countless occasions over the years. Tales become polished and honed and in some cases exaggerated, but that's just human nature, isn't it? And something that we all do, consciously or otherwise. Which tale doesn't grow in the telling? There was one wireless operator I interviewed at an air crew reunion. I think it was in 2017 at Project Propeller. And he even had a pre-prepared sheet setting out his experiences, which was distributed to any attendees who wanted to sort of ask him about it. And this account had been written by the gentleman's son. And this gave me pause to wonder how much influence he'd had on the content and whether words had sort of been put into his father's mouth. But when asked to provide an oral account of his experiences, the wireless operator's tale barely deviated from the written script. But again, everyone was just accepting that, entirely at face value. But you're, I think, intending to write a book about Steve's experiences, aren't you, Ally? But I can see that you potentially got some problems which you need to explore, shall we say?
I think there's a book project in it. What the angle of that is, I'm yet to find out. I think one thing I'd say is that I'm not, despite the discrepancies, I'm incredibly proud of Steve's service, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest he was excellent at his job.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think so. In his annual report, his wing commander says he's well informed and seems to keep himself so. Would probably make a good staff officer, but would prefer a job in a active squadron. It does go on to say that he has the traditional Australian freedom from inhibitions, but is well tempered by responsibility and good sense. That's one for our Australian listeners to expand upon. But it goes on to say he seems to bring out the best in even the worst wireless operators on the squadron. So, and he's been awarded his DFM while he was still an NCO. So Steve should be proud of his service, and I think he was. Obviously, he was. But I'm really intrigued as to why these extra bits have crept in. So maybe that will form part of the narrative of the book. Is that
yeah.
Is that comment on the testimony?
There's so much to be gone into there, isn't it? I mean, I know from sort of having written an aircrew book myself, it's so difficult when you've got counts which don't quite tally. But I think as long as you explain that is the case, that there are inconsistencies and that you acknowledge them, I think that's just part of the story, isn't it? That's just part of history. Yeah. So I think when analysing veteran testimony, the aviation, indeed any historian's got to be prepared to adopt a forensic approach in the same way that a lawyer would examine witness statements and cross-examine the witness in the context of legal proceedings. Historians, I think, have got to probe and challenge and ask these potentially difficult questions and look beyond established accepted narratives and the so-called collective memory. How we do that sort of sensitively and navigate the memory minefield without causing offence to the memory of veterans or their families is a matter for further debate, I think. But I think we've got to avoid the temptation to view veteran testimony as a silver bullet, again using the words of Christopher Browning. I think we've got so much to learn from the approaches used by historians in other disciplines, particularly those who I've mentioned before, working with Holocaust testimony. Well, thanks so much for sharing Steve's story with us, Ally. It sounds like you've got a lot of work on your hands there, but it's been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure it's something which will give our listeners something to think about as well when looking at their own sort of family members' service stories and testimony. I think you've certainly identified a number of issues and problems which many of our listeners will have come across themselves. So, moving on then, coming up in the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about Bomber Command in the Battle of Britain. We're going to be talking about the United States Army Air Force and Masters of the Air, and loads of other great and frequently very random stuff. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back again next week. Thank you. Bye.